So good afternoon. Just checking the mic. Okay, so today I'm going to continue on with reading chapter 11 of the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger. Yesterday I forgot that Dr. Edinger's partner, so I'll just mention it today. Dr. Edinger was the leading Jungian analyst of the late 20th century. He died in 1998, regretfully, but before he died, he founded the C.G. Jung Institute in New York with Edith Harding. That was the name of his partner. Name finally came to me after we terminated yesterday. Good afternoon, Miles. Nice to see you today. And so Edith Harding wrote a wonderful book that I urge you to get and read. It's called Psychic Energy, its Sources and Transformation. And that's an extremely good book to understand Jungian psychology. The other overall book that's extremely good is Erich Neumann's book, and Neumann is spelled Neumann, and his book is called The Origins and History of the Psyche. So going on with this book, what Dr. Edinger is doing is pointing out that in the human species, the way we educate our young is through stories, and that worked very well for a couple thousand years, especially with the Bible, because nobody debated it, nobody doubted it, at least until about 1500. And then we had the Enlightenment, which I call the Endarkenment, because what happened was that when clever scientists started to point out that that the myths of the Bible might not actually be true, people started to turn away from the Bible, and that was a big mistake. And Valis, please stick to the topic today, which is Ahab. And I'm going to let you ride the chat for a bit, but you're on warning that this video is about Dr. Edinger's work, not about you. And so if I start to think that you're using the chat in an inappropriate way, you might get banned. And, that's simple. I'm 73 years old, and I have a short time left in my life. I'm going to do the things I'm going to do. And if I ban you, you won't be back. Very simple. So just so it's clear. Okay. So in any case, the human species has been teaching our young through stories, and the Bible worked very well as long as everybody believed the myths. But unfortunately, when people started to not believe the myths, especially all these logos-oriented rational men, things got bad. And that led, by the end of the 19th century, to Friedrich Nietzsche saying that God is dead. And Dr. Jung came along in the next century and said, no, God is living, and he identified where he lives and how he goes about doing the business of the Godhead. But it was already too late, and the result was that a lot of moral guidelines were chucked out, and the result was World War I and World War II, and the Soviet Union and lots of other awful things, which resulted at the minimum in 175 million deaths in the 20th century. And so nowadays we do this educating through typically through movies, sometimes a little bit through songs, if you can understand the lyrics, and sometimes through art. Um, but the Bible lost its purchase, and so what I believe is that in the fifth stage of consciousness, we have to look back at the Bible and at all the sacred texts of the world and understand what they were teaching us, because they do it very effectively. And you don't have to believe the myth, so called, but you do have to believe that the methods of the religions have worked for many years, and they are a public service. And James says, "Dear Mr. Conover, thank you for your public work. It's inspired me to start revisiting church. Uh, and you've made me aware of a deeper, intriguing um, something in the Bible that I hadn't known of." And that's the point, that you there is so much embedded in religions which evolved over thousands of years that we couldn't possibly completely describe them. And but what is needed is for all theological leaders to go back and restate their religions in terms of modern categories of understanding, because they're not wrong. They're just they've just been ignored because people got so inflated with logos that they forgot why the religions were there at all. And there's no way that any of us can really summarize all the things that are in um, rituals like the Eucharist, or any other ritual, a funeral or a marriage, etc. There are just so many facets to it that you just can't know. But if you give it the benefit of the doubt, you'll find that it starts to open your heart, and it starts to teach you things that you didn't know and should know for society. But so anyway, I don't know what I'm getting into with Ahab here, but today I'm reading from the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger. I'm reading from chapter 11, page 107. And okay, James, I'll have to come back to that issue because I need to do this reading, but it's a fair question. So Ahab. In an ugly sequence of assassination, butchery, and backsliding, 1 Kings 12 through 16 describes the succeeding kings who reigned in the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. These chronicles of kingship remind us of the tragic and ambiguous burden that is imposed on the human being invested with the mantle of royalty. In dreams, a king or head of state is a reference to the self. In history and drama, the king is the ego writ large. He is a limited human being destined to carry a collective transpersonal meaning. The king is always a more or less tragic figure because he must carry the burden of the opposites, the small and human as contrasted with the large and archetypal. Every king is a failure to some extent, either through passivity, a refusal to take up the kingly burden, or through inflation, arrogance, brutality, and hubris. The history of kingship is a picture of ego development. The king was considered quite literally to be God's representative on earth. He is thus an image of the ego's incarnation of the self, that is, individuation. I might add that in the 20th and 21st centuries, we have queens also, such as Queen Elizabeth II, and nobody can doubt that she's developed and is a personification of this as well. And you can see the tragedy involved in her life in the series The Crown, which is now, I think, in its third season. It's a very excellent series, so I urge you to take a look at that. And the same applies to Victoria on Masterpiece and The Young Victoria as a movie. All those movies show what the costs of being a head of state are, man or woman. Ahab was the 7th king of the northern kingdom of Israel and reigned for 22 years. We are told that he did what was displeasing to Yahweh and was worse than all his predecessors. He married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and then proceeded to serve Baal and worship him. He erected an altar to him in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also put up a sacred pole and committed other crimes as well, provoking the anger of Yahweh, the God of Israel, more than all the kings of Israel who were his predecessors. 1 Kings 16, 30 through 33. The term Baal, Lord, was the title of the supreme god among the Canaanites, and in the early period was applied also to Yahweh. After the time of Ahab, however, the name became associated with the worship and rites of the Phoenician deity introduced into Samaria by Jezebel, and its idolatrous associations accordingly caused it to fall into disrepute. Concerning the sacred pole set up by Ahab, Fraser's writes, we know that at all the old Canaanite sanctuaries, including the sanctuaries of Jehovah, down to the reformations of Hezekiah and Josiah, the two regular objects of worship were a sacred stock and a sacred stone, and that these sanctuaries were the seats of profligate rites performed by sacred men, Kadishim, and sacred women, Kadishoth. Jeremiah speaks of those who say, quote, to a stock, thou art my father, and to a stone thou hast brought me forth. Fraser considers this statement to refer to, quote, the children born of the loose intercourse of the sexes at these places, who were believed to be the offspring or emanation of these uncouth but worshipped idols. On this view, the sacred men and women who actually begot or bore the children were deemed the human embodiments of the two divinities, unquote. Such practices were variations of the sacred prostitution of the matriarchal nature religion, which Yahweh worship had supplanted. Ahab was thus guilty of promoting a religious regression. This was intolerable to Yahweh and the new spirit principle. The way Yahweh proceeds to cause Ahab's undoing is chilling to behold. After listening to a pack of false prophets predict success in the attack on Ramoth Gilead, Ahab summons the true prophet, Micaiah, who makes the following announcement, quote, listen rather to the word of Yahweh. I have seen Yahweh seated on his throne. All the array of heaven stood in his presence, on his right and on his left. Yahweh said, "Who will trick Ahab into marching to his death at Ramoth Gilead?" At which some answered one way and some another. Then the Spirit came forward and stood before Yahweh. He said, I will trick him. How? Yahweh asked. He replied, I will go and become a lying spirit in the mouths of all the prophets. You shall trick him, Yahweh. You shall trick him, Yahweh said. You shall succeed. Go and do it. Now see how Yahweh has put a lying spirit into the mouths of all your prophets here. But Yahweh has pronounced disaster on you. 1 Kings 22, 19 to 23. Nice folks. This astonishing piece of divine trickery has a parallel in the Iliad. Quote, now the rest of the gods and men who were lords of chariots slept night long, but the ease of sleep came not upon Zeus, who was pondering in his heart how he might bring honor to Achilles and destroy many beside the ships of Achaeans. Now, to his mind, this thing appeared to be the best counsel, to send evil dream to Atreus, son of Agamemnon. He cried out to the dream and addressed him in winged words. Go forth, evil dream, consider the swift ships of the Achaeans. Make your way to the shelter of Atreus, son Agamemnon. Speak to him in words exactly as I command you. Bid him arm the flowing-haired Achaeans for battle in all haste, since now he might take the wide wayed city of the Trojans. For no longer had the gods who live on Olympus arguing the matter. For no longer are the gods who live on Olympus arguing the matter, since Hera forced them all over by her supplication, and evils are in store for the Trojans. So he spoke, and Dream listened to his word and ascended. Lightly he came down beside the swift ships of the Achaeans, and came to Agamemnon, the son of Atreus. He found him sleeping within his shelter in the cloud of immortal slumber. Dream stood then beside his head in the likeness of Nestor, Neleus' son, whom Agamemnon honored beyond all elders beside. In Nestor's likeness, the divine Dream spoke to him. Son of wise Atreus, breaker of horses, are you sleeping? He should not sleep night long, who is a man burdened with counsels and responsibility for a people and cares so numerous. Listen quickly to what I say, since I am a messenger of Zeus, who far away cares much for you and is pitiful. Zeus bids you arm the flowing-haired Achaeans for battle in all haste, since now you might take the wide-wayed city of the Trojans. For no longer are the gods who live on Olympus arguing the matter, since Hera forced them all over by her supplication, and evils are in store for the Trojans from Zeus. Keep this thought in your heart then. Let not forgetfulness take you after you are released from the kindly sweet slumber. So he spoke and went away, and left Agamemnon there, believing things in his heart that were not to be accomplished. For he thought that on the very day he would take Priam's city. Fool, who knew nothing of all the things Zeus planned to accomplish. Zeus, who yet was minded to visit tears and sufferings on Trojans and Danaans, alike in the strong encounters. These examples demonstrate in a shocking way the ambiguous trickster nature of the unconscious. The God that requires man not to bear false witness, Exodus 20:16, has no qualms on that score about himself. Micaiah's vision of military defeat, quote, I have seen all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep without a shepherd, unquote. 1 Kings 22:17, can also be applied to those who have an innocent, good shepherd attitude toward Yahweh. He is a union of opposites, evil as well as good. God can be loved, but must be feared. For those who would claim that such ambiguities apply only to the Old Testament God and not to the God of love of the New Testament, I would remind them of the Lord's Prayer, where we find these words, quote, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Matthew 6:13. About this request, Jung observes, God is asked not to entice us outright into doing evil, but rather to deliver us from it. The possibility that Yahweh might yet revert to his former ways, is not so remote that one need not keep one eye open for it. At any rate, Christ considers it appropriate to remind his Father of his destructive inclinations. Christ considers it appropriate to remind his Father of his destructive inclinations towards mankind and to beg him to desist from them. Concerning the relation between the Old Testament and the New Testament God, I was once brought an interesting dream. Quote, I am listening to a lecture concerning God's relation to man. The speaker drew a chart on the blackboard, a sort of graph that signified the dealings of God with men. The graph was described as showing the dynamics of God's love and his punishment, the dramatic shifts from pole to pole of his activity. It was pointed out that the activity was less dramatic at the time of Jesus and that the New Testament than it was later in the Old Testament. I suddenly saw that there was psychological wisdom in what was being presented, unquote. The dreamer drew the following graph. Okay, so it's got the Old Testament on one side and the New Testament on the other end, with a squiggly line down that line, and love and wrath above and below. And Dr. Jung always brought into juxtaposition love and hate. So it's the same idea. Jung tells us that to understand it psychologically, the Tibetan Book of the Dead should be read backwards. The same remark applies also to the Bible. The Bible pictures the totality of the psyche. The latest is the closest to consciousness. The earliest is the most remote. What the Bible presents is a sequence of time. What the Bible presents in a sequence of time. What the Bible presents as a sequence in time represents successive strata of deposits in the objective psyche. The empirical exploration of the psyche is very similar to an archaeological dig. The upper layers are the most recent in time and the lower layers more remote. In the process of excavation, the upper layers appear first and the deeper layers appear later. Thus, it is that the psychological realization of the Old Testament Yahweh comes later. Although Ahab was doomed to an ignominious end because of his idolatry, the immediate cause of his downfall was, surprisingly, an act of mercy. After defeating Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, in battle, Ahab accepted his pleas for mercy and made a treaty with him. Yahweh then announced to Ahab, "Since you have let the man escape who was under my ban, your life will pay for this. Your life will pay for his, your people for his people." 1 Kings 20:42. And Ahab fell in battle against Ben-Hadad, who had not honored the treaty. Ahab has reappeared in the modern mind through the imagination of Herman Melville in his novel Moby Dick. Captain Ahab is a central figure, and Elijah puts in a marginal appearance as a crazed seer. Captain Ahab is a central figure, and Elijah puts in a marginal appearance as a crazed seer. Okay, sorry. I hope this only has 2 more pages because I'm losing it. I'll just take a break before I go into Elisha. Take a look at what you said. Granada is correct. The Tao Te Ching, Book of the Dead, Life, Vedas, James Sizemore. I've heard audio readings of the Tao Te Ching, and I've borrowed a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. I'm familiar with the Book of the Dead. Okay, so the Book of the Dead is the Tibetan Book of the Dead or the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There's also an Egyptian one. Oleg says hello. Grenad says Tibetan. Sizemore says howdy. Grenad says it's a mix of Vedic and Taoist. Yes. Sounds interesting. James Sizemore, neat. The graph reminds me of the time wave. Yes. Oleg says, I just wonder why you so interested in Jung and Jungian psychology. For example, I am the artist, I am painter. That's why I want to know how art works and what art is. But what is your purpose? My purpose is to maintain my personal mental balance. And I've been through any number of pretty severe traumas in my lifetime. And I've always turned to Dr. Jung to help me maintain my balance. And so I've lived a pretty happy life, and one that now I feel called to share the benefit of Dr. Jung's wisdom with others. And so that's what I'm doing. And I hope it's useful to you. I have no choice. This is what I do every day. And this is driven by my personal self, my deep unconscious. And, you know, as a great Ray Yates said a day or so ago, Skip has no choice. Yep. So anyway, the Tibetan Book of the Dead contains a psychological commentary by Dr. Jung, and I actually bought, and it's sitting on that file or the bookcase behind me, because I made it a Christmas gift to my wife. My wife is a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and I just point out a couple little secrets here in my room. And she's not Tibetan, she's Caucasian, but she was taken over by Tibetan Buddhism in 1994, and she's completed a full 3-year retreat. She did it at home. It took her 7 years to complete. She never took ordination, but she's one of the leading discussants of Tibetan Buddhism in the Washington, D.C. area, aside from ordained Tibetan Buddhist monks. And so I gave her the Tibetan Book of the Dead that was translated about 1928. I gave her an antique copy, which has Dr. Jung's introduction in it, and that introduction also appears in this book, which is volume 11 of the collected works, Psychology and Religion, West and East. So you can find it in there, and you can find an electronic copy of that in our Dropbox. So if you're not in our Dropbox and you wish to be, you can write to me at skip.conover@gmail.com. Okay, I have recollected my mind, as many of you know. As I read these things, I find them hypnotizing, and the reason they are hypnotizing, the way hypnotic induction works is to overwhelm your mind, and then you're at the you're a slave to the hypnotist, let's say. And so I'm particularly susceptible to hypnotic trance. And in the case of all of Dr. Edinger's work and all of Dr. Jung's work, they say things that are so different from what we've been taught all our lives in the West that your mind just goes, whoa, whoa. And pretty soon you're hypnotized. And so it causes me to actually fall asleep. That's happened. That actually happened yesterday. So anyway, I'm hoping to get through this last 4 or 5 pages here. And James says, my gnosis has led me here. You're in the right place, James. And these days I'm doing a reading every day at 4:30, and I seem to be called to do that now. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to finish this book within this week, I hope. And Mouthpiece of the Muse. Well, maybe not quite, because this is not Mouthpiece for Edinger and Jung. Bernard says, I tried to listen to 7 Sermons of the Dead for 3 nights now, and I fall asleep 5 minutes in every time. Yes, I did read the 7 Sermons of the Dead a year and a half ago or so. So, and they are a major part of scrutinies of the Red Book, but that's a different topic all the time. But anyway, if you have trouble sleeping, you can definitely turn on my videos and just put your headset in and you'll be gone. Okay, so I'm still reading from the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger. I'm in chapter 11, page 111, and I'm going to read about Elisha. The name of this chapter is Prophets and Kings. So this is Elisha, Elisha. The mantle of Elijah is passed on to Elisha, who performs many miracles. A particularly instructive one is the healing of Naaman. Quote, Naaman, army commander of the king of Aram, was a man who enjoyed his master's respect and favor, since through him Yahweh had granted victory to the Armenians. but the man was a leper. Now, on one of their raids, the Armenians had carried off from the land of Israel a little girl who had become a servant of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would approach the prophet of Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went and told his master. "This and this," he reported, "is what the girl said from the land of Israel." I'm not reading that quite right. "This and this," he reported, "is what the girl from the land of Israel said." Quote, "Go by all means," unquote, said the king of Aram. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, and taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 festal robes, he presented the letter to the king of Israel. It read, quote, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you for you to cure him of his leprosy," unquote. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his garments. Quote, "Am I a God to give death and life?" he said. Okay, so, "Am I a God to give death and life?" he said, "that he sends me a man, he sends a man to me and asks me to cure him of his leprosy. Listen to this and take note of it and see how he intends to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha heard that the king of Israel had torn his garments, he sent word to the king, "Why did you tear your garments? Let him come to me, and he will find there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his team and chariot and drew up at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent him a messenger to say, quote, "Go and bathe 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will become clean once more." But Naaman was indignant and went off, saying, "Here I was thinking he would be sure to come out to me and stand there and call on the name of Yahweh his God and wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprous part. Surely Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, are better than any water in Israel. Could I not bathe in them and become clean?" And he turned round and went off in a rage. But his servants approached him and said, "My father, if the prophet had asked you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? All the more reason. Then when he says to you, 'Bathe, and you will become clean.'" So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, as Elisha had told him to do. And his flesh became clean once more, like the flesh of a little child. Returning to Elisha with his whole escort, he went in and stood before him. "Now I know," he said, "that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now please accept a present from your servant." But Elisha replied, "As Yahweh lives, whom I serve, I will accept nothing." Naaman pressed him to accept, but he refused. Then Naaman said, "Since your answer is no, allow your servant to be given as much earth as 2 mules may carry, because your servant will no longer offer holocaust or factory or sacrifice to any god except Yahweh. Only, and may Yahweh forgive your servant, when my master goes to the temple of Rimmon to worship there, he leans on my arm, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon when he does. May Yahweh forgive your servant this act." "Go in peace," Elisha answered. Naaman had gone a small distance when Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, said to himself, "My master has let this Aramean Naaman off lightly by not accepting what he offered." As Yahweh lives, I will run after him and get something out of him. So Gehazi set off in pursuit of Naaman. When Naaman saw him running after him, he jumped down from his chariot to meet him. Is all well? He asked. All is well, he said. My master has sent me to say, this very moment 2 young men of the prophetic brotherhood have arrived from the highlands of Ephraim. Be kind enough to give them a talent of silver. Please accept 2 talents, Naaman replied, and pressed him, tying up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags and consigning them to 2 of his servants, who carried them in front of Gehazi. When he reached Ophel, he took them from their hands and put them away in the house. He then dismissed the men who went away. He, for his part, went and presented himself to his master. Elisha said, Gehazi, where have you been? Quote, your servant has not been anywhere, he replied. But Elisha said to him, was not my heart present there when someone left his chariot to meet you? Now you have taken the money. You can buy gardens with it and olive groves, sheep and oxen, male and female slaves. But Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever. And Gehazi left his presence a leper, white as snow. 2 Kings, 2 Kings 5, 1 through 27. This story can serve as a paradigm for the process of depth psychotherapy. Naaman, the ego, is ill. He learns of the possibility of healing from the foreign anima who comes from Yahweh's holy land, the unconscious. He decides to seek out the healer prophet of Israel. That is, he decides to visit an analyst. Naaman presents his letter to the king of Israel, but the king is alarmed by his extravagant expectation. Am I a god to give death and life? Thus will the analyst's ego react to the patient's assumption that the analyst has the power to heal him. Jung often told his patients that he didn't know how to help them, but there is a 2-million-year-old man within them. He will know what to do. This wise old man is the personification of the instinctual wisdom of the unconscious and corresponds to the figure of Elisha. Elisha's invitation for Naaman to visit him indicates that inner archetypal wisdom has been constellated and help from the unconscious is forthcoming. The prescription is to bathe 7 times in the Jordan River. This is a recipe for solutio. He is to immerse himself in the waters of the unconscious and experience the death and rebirth that is implied by that image. In other words, he must open himself to the effects of his dreams and fantasies and follow their wisdom to dissolve his problem. 7 is the number of initiation, transformation, and creative action completed. 7 rungs of the planetary ladder stand between earth and heaven, and creation took 7 days. Naaman reacts to this prescription with rage. He had expected a treatment from Elisha, who would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprous part. The idea that one should consult the unconscious is an offense to the rational ego. However, his servants counseled a wiser course. They represent the lowly, modest aspects of the personality in better touch with psychic reality. Naaman does immerse himself in the Jordan 7 times and is healed. This image condenses a process that in practical psychotherapy may take years. The experience of the unconscious often does lead to a transformation. Jung says, quote, analysis should release an experience that grips us or falls upon us as from above, an experience that has substance and body, such as those things which occurred to the ancients. If I were going to symbolize it, I would choose the Annunciation, unquote. And of course, the Annunciation is the arrival of, I think it's the angel Gabriel, who tells Mary that she is with child with the Son of God, unquote. Naaman's baptism in the Jordan, like Christ, brought about such an experience. This is followed naturally by the appearance of a religious attitude. Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel, and by an outpouring of gratitude to the man who made the experience possible. The latter is indicated by Naaman's offer to give Elisha a gift. This signifies a transference projection whereby the patient, Naaman, would attribute a psychic value to the analyst, Elisha, that does not properly belong to him. Elisha wisely declines the gift. To accept it would mean identification with the transference projection. Elisha would then take personal credit for Naaman's healing. That act of hubris would have disastrous consequences, for it would make him responsible for Naaman's destiny as a whole. This latter consequence is represented by Gehazi, who accepted Naaman's gift and received with it his leprosy as well. The load of earth transported from Israel to Naaman's homeland becomes the ground on which the altar to Yahweh is built. Earth is a coagulatio image. Coagulatio refers to alchemy. Earth is a coagulatio image, and in this context refers to a realization of the transpersonal psyche, which becomes the ground on which a living religious attitude is constructed. This attitude is the factor that heals. Okay, there's one more page and one more type. Oleg says, Edward Edinger was the best student of Jung, but what about Erich Neumann? Neumann probably was the most favorite student of Jung because he had his own opinion and thoughts. Well, they were different generations. I mean, Erich Neumann was, in effect, the thought of as the crown prince of Dr. Jung at one point, but he died. He actually died before Dr. Jung did, and I'm not sure how many times Dr. Edinger actually met Dr. Jung. Maybe only once, but his career came along after the death of both of those men, and his famous lectures, which you can hear on YouTube, were in the 1980s. The most famous two are in 1984 and 1988, and you can find transcripts of them on archetypeinaction.com. I personally transcribed them, so I know exactly where they are. So Oleg says, fun fact, Jung was a fan of sci-fi books and novels. Yep, might be so. Okay, last page. So I'm in chapter 11 of the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger. And this is the last page. Hazael and Jehu. And the overall title of the chapter is Prophets and Kings. So this is Hazael and Jehu. In 1 Kings, Yahweh tells Elijah on Mount Horeb, quote, you are to go and anoint Hazael as king of Aram. You are to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king of Israel. Anyone who escapes the sword of Hazael will be put to death by Jehu, and anyone who escapes the sword of Jehu will be put to death by Elisha. 1 Kings 19, 15 to 17. These assignments were carried out by Elisha. He visited Hazael and a subordinate of King Ben-Hadad, and cunningly incited him to assassination. Like the witches in Macbeth, he told the ambitious Hazael, "In a vision from Yahweh, I have seen you king of Aram." 2 Kings 8:13. Thus, Elisha fulfilled Yahweh's assignment to anoint Hazael. In this account, inciting his ambition to seize the throne is symbolically equivalent to anointing him king. A similar anointing was done to Jehu. Elisha dispatched a young prophet who, quote, poured the oil on his head, saying, "Yahweh, the God of Israel, says this: I have anointed you king over the people of Yahweh, king of Israel. You are to strike down the family of Ahab, your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and of all the servants of Yahweh on Jezebel and the whole family of Ahab." 2 Kings 9, 6 through 8. In other words, Yahweh puts out a murder contract against King Jehoram, Jezebel, and the entire royal family, which bloody deed was duly carried out. Sound much like 1917 to anybody? The anointings of Hazael and Jehu signify psychologically an influx from the unconscious, which tells the ego to kill the current king or ruling principle and seize power. This message is presented as God's will. Such an occasion is a moment of terrible ambiguity. The assignment is an individuation imperative, and to ignore it can be fatal, but to take concretely and literally a symbolic message can be equally fatal. Orestes, in Aeschylus's drama, was in such a position and barely escaped with his sanity. Vengeance belongs to God, Psalms 94:1. That is, revenge is from the self, but the self needs the ego to realize it. And if that realization amounts to a literal crime, the ego is left holding the bag. Hate it when that happens. A modern pathological version of the anointing of Jehu was reported some years ago in the newspaper. An adolescent boy was told by God in a hallucinatory vision to kill his family. He laid in wait for them in the bushes and shot them all with a rifle. Jung is reported to have said that if God told him to murder someone, he wouldn't do it, but instead would interpose against God and die if necessary. As Jung says, God is a most shocking problem, unquote. He said that in Visions seminar. Okay, so tomorrow I will be reading chapter 12, Exile and Return. I might be a little bit later than 4:30 in that tomorrow we have our advanced reading group seminar, which begins at 1:30, and these have been running very long, but I will do my best to save enough voice so that I can read from chapter 12, The Chosen People. It'll be a very interesting day. I see the chat is a little slow at the moment, so I'm going to excuse myself. And for the advanced reading group members, I will see you tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. And for everyone else, I'll see you as soon after 4:30 as I can manage it for chapter 12. Thank you for joining me today.